It's that hour, so let's get started. Welcome back. Glad to see you here. I know some told me that they couldn't make it this week, and I'm sure it'll be, but I hope to be back next week. We're going to look together this evening at the Gospel of Mark in particular, and obviously this is the evening class on 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus. So why don't we open in prayer? Father in heaven, we are thankful for the infinite value and riches of your Son and the redemption that he has made possible for us, infinite in his person as divine, but also infinite in what he has accomplished for us and for our salvation. We are grateful to know him through your word and by your Spirit working within us to read it and to understand it. We're grateful, Father, for your wisdom in deciding what to give us. We pray that you would make it us good stewards of it, that you would help us even as we delve into the differences between Gospels, to cherish what is there and to make good and edifying use of it, to see our Savior more clearly. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. There's a handout, so there's some copies back there if you didn't get one, and it also should be available online for those of you who are streaming. And it's simple, just kind of taking you through the outline for tonight. Give you some landmarks so that you kind of know where we're at and maybe a few key terms. In preparing this, realized that we may not get through all of this tonight, but we have 2 more weeks later. And what I would like to do is focus us particularly on the Gospel of Mark. I'm committing more time here than to the other Gospels for a few reasons. One is it's often less well known, partly because of what we talked about last time, that it's the shortest, and so the way that people have sometimes read the Gospels in the past with the assumptions that they've used, the lens that they've used, it kind of seems to add the least to our understanding, which of course, as we talked about last time, is a misunderstanding, but it hasn't received as much attention. Secondly, the Gospel of Mark sometimes defies our expectations if we're more familiar with Matthew or Luke or even John, which many people are. Thirdly, it's shorter, and so we can do more with it. We can be a little bit more representative there. And so we're going to take more time trying, in a sense, you might say, to experience this gospel by looking at some various texts and so forth. And so we may not get through it tonight, but we'll make a good effort. So firstly, on your outline, just a little bit of recap and then extending what we talked about last time a little bit as well. Approaching 4 Gospels. So we set the question, why 4 Gospels? Really what we mean in this case is why plural Gospels? Not really so concerned with the number 4, but just why plural? Why not just one long one that had all of the pieces that the others have? And we asked the question last time, why plural Gospels when they are so similar? So much of it is overlapping. But then also why plural Gospels when they're so different? Their presentation of the same basic material differs so much that it ends up producing a lot of questions about how all the pieces fit together. And so then what are we to do with that? I'd like to look tonight to extend a little bit farther on that topic, but reinforce what we said last time, to read with you actually 3 passages. One of them I didn't list here, but John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And then we're going to read also the last verse of John, and then also Luke 1 through 4. Each of these shows us something different about how the gospel writers understood what they were doing that's important for us on this issue of why 4 or why plural. So John here in John chapter 20 and beginning at verse 30, gives us a comment about a few things related to his writing this gospel. It says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." That is a direct recognition of selectivity on the author's part, John's part, right? to say there was a large set of information that I can choose from, and I've chosen these, right? Now, of course, when he says that, we can recognize that John chose very differently than Matthew, Mark, or Luke in many instances. There's some overlap, but actually relatively little overlap of directly the same events being recorded. And even when there is overlap of what's recorded, there's also some significant differences of what's said about those events. Then he goes on in verse 31, but these are written, these signs are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. This is a statement of purpose, a statement that what he selected to write about, he selected for a particular purpose, and the you isn't directly identified, but it seems to in particular be Christians, not unbelievers that he wants to believe for the first time, but believers that he wants to continue to believe. That's based in part on the Greek verb there, which is a verb of continuation, that in order that you may continue believing, you could translate it, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. If you turn the page to John 21, verse 25, the very last verse, he comes back to this topic of selectivity, you could say. So he says in verse John 21, 25, now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. This is an even broader statement about almost the infinite nature, the exceedingly large nature of all of the things that Jesus did, right? Which could never be contained in however many books you could possibly write. And so again, they have to choose. You see here a reflection on it's impossible to exhaust this topic. Everyone who writes is going to have to choose parts of it, right? And so this is part of what we're talking about here. And so you could say this, that even if you were to take Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and put them all together into one, firstly, we already said it's really impossible to do without lots and lots of questions that you're not sure if you're answering the questions right, which exact pieces are the same and which ones are different and what order they all go in, etc. But even if you could do that, it's still not everything, right? Because 4 can't exhaust what happened. And so the Lord evidently then, as we look at what we have, has a different approach. He's not seeking historical exhaustiveness, right? But he's seeking to truly tell us about what happened. And we could say each of these authors takes the information that was there, takes the events that were there, and chooses aspects of it to tell us about. And evidently, according to God's own design, that way of doing it is better for us than one really long account, which can't be comprehensive anyway. So John is recognizing here directly 2 of the things I have written there. One is selectivity on the part of the author, and the other is that the author makes his choices, including his choices of what to put in the book, what not to put in the book, for a particular purpose. If we turn over to Luke 1 through 4, we see something similar. Some aspects of it are similar. Here we see in particular Luke's reflections on arrangement, not so much selectivity, although that's there, but it's not accented as much. More we see the authorial decisions with regard to the necessity to arrange things in some way or another, along with, again, reflection on purpose. So Luke 1 through 4 says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So he's recognizing that there are many other accounts, is what he says. Whatever he means by many, we don't know, but there are certainly other accounts about these things that have been accomplished among us, which, of course, is essentially Jesus' earthly ministry, right? Because that's what he's going to go on to talk about. just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So he's reflecting on the sources that he used to get information, people who had actually seen what happened, right? You'll come to understand partly through this and partly through other things that Luke himself was not one of those eyewitnesses, but he consulted those who were. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past. So he's seen some things. That's probably why in Acts you get the passages where the so-called we passages, where the Acts speaks in the first person plural about we did this, we did that, because in those parts, Luke himself was actually there. That's the most likely view of that. So he had seen some things, but more having to do with the topics in Acts. These things in Luke, not directly, he wasn't direct witness of, but he used other people who were as sources. But the point we're getting at, it seemed too good to me also to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. That phrase there, an orderly account, indicates that Luke wants to put things carefully in a particular order, right? Now, it's clear that the order that Luke chose is not the order that Matthew chose or Mark chose or John chose, right? But there's something about the sequence in Luke that he's purposeful about, and he goes on in verse 4 to say something about why, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Now, we're not really focusing on Luke here, but just to say this, Luke is saying that he's going to put things in a particular sequence and order. There's a fair amount of chance that that is predominantly a chronological order. That's a supposition, but it could be. Particularly, we can definitely tell that both Mark and Matthew choose more of a topical order different times. But whatever the case is, there's different ways you could explain what exactly Luke means by orderly, like what order was it. But he wants you to see how certain sequences happen again and again and again. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Luke itself. He, in fact, wants you to see how certain sequences took place in Luke, Jesus' life, and then also took place again in Acts. We'll come back to that. But for now, our purpose is more simple, to just recognize what we could deduce logically anyway, but here we see scriptural precedent for saying it. The gospel writers are selective, and they choose an order or arrangement of material in order to accomplish their particular purposes. And somehow in Luke, that order, selectivity and order, is going to help Theophilus have more certainty about the things he's already learned about in his, you might say, catechism instruction or something like that, right? His early instruction in the faith. These things help us say then that each of these documents shows design or craft, right? They are each unique, stylized, individually designed portraits or documentaries, if you will, of Jesus' life. The portrait is, of course, the simpler analogy, and we talked about it in a basic way last time. I can still see the outline of my frames here. So we looked a little bit at Mark, right? And we looked just the opening of Mark and the opening of Matthew. And we said, let's start with a blank canvas. And then just note for yourself what comes onto the canvas and when, right? And we immediately saw very different things coming onto the canvas in Mark initially compared to Matthew initially, right? The things that came to the center and that were the dominant concern, like the wilderness in Mark and demon exorcisms, Jesus casting out demons and conflict with Satan and those kinds of things, right? And what immediately comes out here is Jesus' long pedigree back into the generations of Israel, all the way back to David and all the way back to Abraham, right? So in a very brief way, you could say, we'll talk about some of these things more, but divine Son of God who conflicts with demons, the spiritual battle, versus and I mean that lightly, of course, but as compared to human and divine, but he's focusing on the human lineage, right? Having a human descent to David and then also to Abraham, right? Who's someone who's a Jew, but also in a kingly line. And even just those basic things, you immediately begin to see differences of focus. And so this is what we want to do then, is explore this more. Under letter C on your outline, how to read. And so the basic answer is we want to read looking for design, looking for intent, looking for those things that would help us notice and appreciate Mark's canvas and his eventual portrait, right? How does he fill the whole thing out, and what kind of portrait of Jesus does he end up with as compared to Matthew's, Luke's, or John's? The documentary analogy is a little bit more helpful in the sense that a portrait is just one canvas, right? Whereas these stories are really long and you have different sequences and scenes and lots of things come back to back to back to back, and like you see in a movie, right? Scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and you get an experience of those over time. But the same basic point is made either way. So how do we read? We look for design. And some of the things we just need to sometimes step back and appreciate as modern readers is that the form that our Bible comes to us in gives us a lot of interpretation that isn't there in the original. So the original doesn't have chapters, doesn't have verses, it doesn't have headings, it doesn't have little sidebars to explain things, or italicized or bolded sections. It doesn't have like a lot of study Bibles, an introduction, right, to tell you different things. Really, the authors had a more sparing approach. It's just the words on the page that have to make their own point. They have to grab your attention and show you what's supposed to stand out to you. And the ways that they do this are a variety of things, and I'll just mention some here. The order in which things come. You're supposed to notice order. First, second, third, first, middle, last. The beginnings and the endings are particularly important for shaping your perception, right? What did you see first? What you saw first colors or shapes your perception of everything that comes after, right? Because it comes after, right? Only the first thing comes first. What comes last is sort of what you're left with at the very end, right? Like as the credits roll and you're like, oh yeah, boy, that ended this way. And it was a sad ending, it was a happy ending, it was whatever, right? Grouping has an order issue to it, right? The order that you put things in can put several things close together versus very spread apart. And sometimes when you read the Gospels, you say, well, all of the Gospel writers have these, we're going to see this tonight, have these same 3 events, but they don't come in such close proximity in Matthew or Luke as they come in Mark. And therefore, because they come in greater proximity the way Mark arranged things, they sort of gang up on you, right? They stand out more, and they're supposed to. You're supposed to notice the similarity that it keeps happening this way, right? This is one of the things that happens because of Mark's being shorter. He can put things closer together, right, as he chooses to. Whereas in Matthew, you might not see this second thing for another 3 chapters. And so the relationship doesn't stand out as clearly. So order, what's first, what's middle, what's last, and then grouping is an order issue. Repetition, whether or not things are grouped. If something's repeated a lot, it's supposed to stand out, right? It's getting your attention. So like we saw, the wilderness motif is frequently repeated in chapter 1, other things that were frequently repeated. Setting. Setting is very important. The places that are mentioned, we're going to look at several of those tonight, one in particular. Conflict. Who exactly is it in conflict with whom and about what? The basic conflicts that we saw at the beginning of Mark and the beginning of Matthew are different, right? At the beginning of Mark, it was especially Jesus against the demons. That's what keeps happening again and again and again. It's Satan himself, and then various demons. Concentrated in Matthew, it's clearly a dynastic kingship issue, right? Rightful heir to the throne of David. That's why you have the genealogies back to David. That's why you have Joseph, son of David, right? That's why you have Herod, king in Israel, etc. and the Magi and so forth and so on. So the basic conflict, a spiritual conflict against demons or a dynastic conflict between different sons of David. And then sixthly, you want to look at summary statements when the gospel writer or somebody in the gospel summarizes what's happened. That means that they're distilling things down to what's really important, right? When you boil something down into okay, and then also other types of interpretive statements, even if it's not a summary of lots of stuff. Anything that somebody in the gospel, like the writer himself or Jesus or an angel or somebody tells you why something happened, right? Those are all ways, the order, repetition, things about setting, things about conflict. These are just some of the things that when you look at these documents, they're part of the craft, part of the design that's supposed to tell you where to look, what to focus on, and why it matters, right? If you had a good high school English class or college English class, some of these things might sound familiar to you from there. All right, so let's dive in a little bit. Mark's gospel. We can recall some of what we talked about last time from chapter 1, just to get ourselves refreshed in our minds and a running start back into this. Setting. The big setting was wilderness versus society, right? The wilderness was the good setting. It's where Isaiah and other biblical texts said the way of the Lord should be prepared. And so it's where John showed up to prepare the way. And then it's where Jesus showed up and received the Holy Spirit and was declared God's son. And then he went even further into the wilderness to do battle with Satan, right? And he comes into town preaching, but then he keeps withdrawing back to the wilderness again and again due to the crowds and so forth, right? So wilderness was like where we belong or where Jesus belongs, where God's redemption is occurring. That was setting. Selectivity and arrangement. Lots of things here, but we saw the word immediately over and over again. We also saw that Mark is selecting very brief texts. We got quickly through John the Baptist's own ministry, Jesus' baptism, the temptation, and Jesus' initial preaching throughout Galilee in 15 verses. And then in the rest, we had this flurry of activity of, there's calling of some disciples and then a flurry of exorcisms. So the word immediately is repeated a lot. Short texts, short sections most of the time. And lots of action, not lots of teaching. It's very different from both Matthew and Luke and John, where all three of which have very extended times of Jesus' teaching being directly recorded, where most of the time Mark just summarizes, right? Jesus went around teaching and preaching, right? The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the gospel, brief, okay? And so you have this sense of the gospel being a gospel of action. If you were to compare the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark to a movie, it would be a movie with a lot of short clips and changes of perspective, and the camera's a little bit shaky because there's so many things happening immediately, right? Like you have a sense of being propelled into a war, a conflict, it would be like a war movie given what's happening. And not a war movie where you're in the general's, officer's room planning the war, but where you're right down there in the middle of things, right? And so it's supposed to be something that grabs your attention and is forceful. This is going to fit with the content. It does fit with the content already of chapter 1. It's going to fit with the content of what follows as well. The opening 8 chapters of Mark have sometimes been called the book of power or the book of glory, meaning that Jesus' great power in his ministry is again and again and again on display. The intensity of his miracles, the number of his miracles, the unique nature of these miracles as compared to any miracles anybody else ever did, such as calming the sea and walking on water and so forth. And so you're propelled into this. And what did we also remember this little detail that when Jesus was at his baptism, the heavens were torn open, right? It's this violent imagery of this place being taken by storm, as it were, the kingdom of God invading and displacing Satan's rule in the world. So those are some of the things that we talked about. If you look at the setting, you look at selectivity and arrangement, some of the characters, demons come up a lot, etc. The character of the Son of God. I think I'll come back to that one later, but I already said before, Son of God can mean a lot of things. Here it really means divine Son of God, and you get that clearer and clearer as the gospel goes on. Some other distinctive features of Mark, just things that people often notice, and the shorter nature of it makes things often more intense and makes certain aspects of the action stand out instead of others. And then the order that things come in. Mark is well known for its triads. We're going to see that in a little bit here. Things that come in threes. In other gospels, they might come in ones or twos, but they come in groups of three. It happens quite a lot. Another thing is what scholars call an intercalation, which is a simpler word would be a sandwich, where Mark will start a story. It's like the outside bread on the one side, and then he'll start a new story, and then he'll finish the first story and give you that other slice of bread, right? This happens again and again, triads and intercalation. And so it's clear that Mark is trying to put things together and make you see them in relationship to each other by the way that his order differs from what often happens in the other Gospels. All right, so that's a lot of stuff there, but let's dive into some texts. We looked at Mark 1 last time. Obviously, there's a lot more that can be said, but we're trying to do an overview so that you'll get a good snapshot here and then a snapshot of each of the other four to compare. If you go into all the details, then you can't do that in the same way, kind of like with Mark. The shorter one makes you see it differently. So let's slow down though some and look at some aspects of Mark 2 and 3. Mark 2 and 3, I titled it Conflicts at Home. And so obviously that indicates a different primary setting, right? A different primary place. And the reason to say that is a few things, but some of them are, again, repetition, and also framing, meaning what comes at the beginning of chapter 2 and at the end of chapter 3. I make some references here to setting, but when you're reading the Gospels, you have to notice when it talks about places and try to figure out what is significant about that. We notice in chapter 1, wilderness, 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 wilderness over and over and again, along with wild honey, wild animals, right? Other things that are wild. Now at chapter 2 it says, and when he, Jesus, returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And that, of course, has a lot of associations to it, but he's returning to Capernaum. He already went to Capernaum before in chapter 121, but here in chapter 2, Mark makes an additional comment that this is Jesus' home, right? This is what's familiar to him, his home region. And then in chapter 2, verse 15, after the initial miracle there of the healing of the paralytic, probably useful to notice along the way verse 13, is going to talk about a different setting that becomes really, really important later. He went out beside the sea, and the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them, and as he passed by, he called some disciples. We're going to see that the sea becomes a really important setting later. Right now, there's a small piece of that, and then verse 15 says, and as he reclined at table in his house, right? So 2:1 and 2:15 repeat home, house. And then at the end of chapters 2 and 3, it says in chapter 3, verse 20, then he went home, and the crowd gathered again. And then his family gets introduced. Chapter 3, verse 21, his family heard it. They went out to seize him, for they were saying he's out of his mind. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then in chapter 3, 31 through 35, the whole thing is clearly about Jesus being in a home, a house structure. It's also all about his mother and his brothers seeking him. And so what you get, if you're looking at a canvas in the end of chapter chapter 3, is some kind of building structure, a house, right, with Jesus in the middle of it, and lots of people all around him, and crowding the door so that his mother and his brothers are outside, right? And this is what the whole piece of that story, 3:31 through 35, revolves around. His mother and his brother have to send messengers in to seek Jesus, and then he uses that opportunity to say, well, who are my mother and my brother and my sisters, right? In other words, he comes directly to the topic of the relationship between natural family and God's own family, and the fact that those aren't the same, right? Those aren't identical. So in chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 2, verse 15, chapter 3, verse 20, and then the entirety of 3:31 through 35, all of it is very clearly about home and house, right? And as you read that, then it all wraps together. It's like a framing thing, right? You start off this way and you end this way, and so then it shows you that you're supposed to take everything in between in connection with those, that in the light of that frame. It's actually house language in between, like 3:25. If a house is divided against itself, the house will not be able to stand, 3:25. And then the plundering of possessions, of course, is like the 3:27. The strong man can plunder the house under certain circumstances. So really the whole end of it has all to do with home. Now, what happens at home? If the dominant setting in chapters 2 and 3 is Jesus being at home, is that very warm and fuzzy and affirming? The answer is no. What happens at home is a lot of conflict and misunderstanding. And the conflict initially is with some new characters that show up. So if you're looking at setting, the dominant setting is being at home, regionally speaking, or in an actual house. And then if you're looking at characters, new people show up. So chapter 2, verse 6, the scribes. Chapter 2, verse 16, the scribes of the Pharisees. Chapter 3, verse 6, the Pharisees and the Herodians and others. And these people begin debating with Jesus, accusing him of things, asking him questions, trying to trap him. And what then is the response of his family? He's at home, right? Well, this is not encouraging. Go back to 3:20, the end of this section. Now he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that he could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he's out of his mind. That's not a good start. They think that somewhere or another, things aren't adding up and he's acting weird and strange. So obviously they don't understand something about his purpose. And then the family part continues in 331 after all the stuff in the middle. But in the middle, the scribes, again, 322, accuse him of one of his principal activities so far in the gospel was casting out demons, that he's casting out demons because he has the power of the prince of demons, or Beelzebul. And so then Jesus describes how ludicrous that is, and the nature of kingdom warfare. The kingdom of God opposes the kingdom of Satan, rather than the kingdom of Satan opposing the kingdom of Satan, and how a house or kingdom has to be unified within itself, otherwise it will topple over. People are still accusing him of having an unclean spirit, and so his family is trying to intervene. And in 331, his mother and brothers came, standing outside of where Jesus was in this building of whatever sort. They sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." Notice how the repetition there? We already knew that his mother and brothers were outside seeking him, but the crowd says it again, right? Which makes a point of it. It's like putting it in bold, right? It's like saying, in case you missed it, this was important. And then Jesus answered, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Which, of course, is a question that would take everybody off guard. Well, it could be the sort of thing that someone who's out of his mind would say. His family thought he was out of his mind, but he's not out of his mind, of course. Looking at those who sat around him in this circle around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers," meaning the ones here listening to his teaching, right? "For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." And so what Jesus has done there is redefine the nature of God's own family or kingdom, God's house, not around natural lineage or family relationship or descent of a natural kind, right? Which, of course, many Jews thought it was defined that way, but instead around what he says is doing the will of God, or doing the will of my Father. Another version of it says, "That one is my brother and sister and mother." And so what do we see here in the aggregate in chapters 2 and 3? Well, we started in the wilderness with John the Baptist and Jesus and acts of God and heavens being torn and spirit coming, and then we come into town with guns blazing and cast out a lot of demons. And then we come home and are misunderstood and constantly experiencing conflict with both religious leaders and family, right? Again, how different is that in terms of your second major thing that you see in the Gospel of Mark compared to Matthew? Matthew was generation upon generation upon generation of continuity, and then Jesus' fatherly lineage, Joseph, right? And then Jesus' father and mother taking him, protecting him, fleeing to Egypt with him, and then and being warned in a dream and all these things, right? And then coming and going to Nazareth again to protect him. In Matthew, Nazareth first appears, Galilee, region where Jesus was from, first appears as a place of haven from Herod, where his family takes him to make him safe, right? Now, both of these things are true, of course, but they're also quite different at different parts of Jesus' own life. And what you don't get in Mark is any kind of birth narrative or genealogy. What you do get instead is a pretty confusing, relatively negative portrayal of family. Okay? Jesus experienced both. He had a true and loving family from a long lineage of Jewish derivation, right, including Davidic descent. But he also was not understood by his family in many ways, much of his earthly life, right? One of those is what Mark chooses to highlight for us. The being misunderstood by family, which of course is something that we need to also know about and understand that Jesus experienced, something of course that some of us experience ourselves, or certainly could experience in our lives, right? Evidently, for Mark's purposes, this is something to highlight. And this is sort of just beginning, because the Gospel of Mark as a whole is going to see Jesus more isolated than in any other gospel. We're going to see that all the way in many respects until the end of this particular gospel. Jesus misunderstood, isolated, abandoned, right? Now, of course, that's not the entire picture all by itself, but it is a very strong ingredient here, and it's something that Mark wanted his audience to understand too. Now, you can ask the question, which we don't have an answer to, but why did Mark want to present this so strongly? You're going to see it again in chapter 6. Later on, comes back to the hometown theme and the rejection in the hometown theme. There's not anything unambiguously, I shouldn't say maybe anything, there's not very much unambiguously positive about family relations in Mark, right? What's happening in the context within which Mark writes that he wants this element of Jesus' experience to be put strongly forward for his readers? Well, maybe they're being abandoned by their family members. We don't know, right? But this is obviously an aspect of Jesus' own experience that speaks to us strongly in certain ways, and would have also to his audience. So it's an example of selectivity and arrangement, right? Go from the wilderness to home, and the principal thing that Jesus experiences is conflict and misunderstanding, right? Any questions about that? Probably not. Let's take another step forward before our break and look at chapter 4, part of it. I want you to notice something here. Mark chapter 4. This is the parable of the sower, and it's familiar, but Mark puts it back to back with this episode about the family. So if you were to kind of turn the page in a sense, or if you're thinking of a movie, like the next frame, you go from this scene where Jesus is in a house and he's surrounded by people and teaching them about the true nature of God's family, and then his own natural family are outside. And of course, that's not saying that his own natural family aren't Christians or aren't believers, but it's an image. It's making the point that being natural family isn't what makes you part of God's family. So there's insiders around Jesus, and then there's those who are outside. The text makes that very clear several times. It's actually a bit more evident in the Greek, but in 3:31, his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him. Verse 32, your mother and brothers are outside seeking you, right? And it repeats several times that there are people inside who are sitting around him. We read the parable of the sower. Notice some of the connections that get built by putting these two stories right next to each other. First of all, we're going to be back to the sea, notice that for now. It'll pay off more later. Again, Jesus, chapter 4, verse 1, began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside him, beside the sea on the land. What word was repeated 3 times? Sea. He's kind of belaboring it a little bit, right? Like, didn't have to be said all those times. Some of them are a little extra. If you really had a problem with word count, you could have gotten some of those out of there, right? Then he tells this parable, which we're familiar with, right? A sower goes out and sows seeds, etc., and he speaks this way. And then notice in verse 10, and when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parable, and he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. And he said to them, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? And he goes on and interprets the parable of the sower. Now there's several really important components here. I'll just point them out, and then we'll unpack why they're important more after a break. But he starts with a crowd. He gets out to the sea, separate from the crowd, to teach them. Right? He uses the sea to get some distance and space. They're on the shore. Then, after that, he goes away from the crowd to be alone with his disciples and says, there's 2 kinds of people, those who are around me here in private and those who are outside, or outside of this circle of fellowship, right? They're insiders and they're outsiders. And to insiders, the secret of the kingdom of God is given, right? The key to understanding. To outsiders, I speak in parables so that they won't understand. This is a form of course, Jesus' own divine judgment against unbelieving Israel. But this separation from the crowd, part of the time on the sea, part of the time we're not sure where they're at, but they're alone. Teaching them in private, the secret or the key to unlock and understand his teaching, that is only done for insiders, right? You're getting a repetition of a theme. Insiders versus outsiders. Again, that was metaphorical, but the next one's very literal, right? Those around him with the 12, notice that around him language, versus outsiders. Outsiders won't understand. Insiders will understand. But then did you notice in verse 13, he sort of sounds puzzled. Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? This question of understanding is going to come up numerous times. The disciples, Jesus has just stated, are insiders. They're being given what they need to know to understand. They're not like the crowd. They're not like the religious leaders. They're privileged in this insider kind of way, but they don't seem to be on the uptake about it. They don't seem to get it, and we'll notice that happens several more times in what follows. So let's pause there. We're going to use that passage in Mark 4 as a jumping off point to look at 2 different triads after this, 2 different sets of 3 that Mark gives us later. So let's take our break now. We'll take 15 minutes. All right. I think we got our 15 minutes in there, if I remember the time correctly when we left. So why don't we get started back up? A couple comments about this parable of the sower in Mark. one of the things is you can tell it's important because of its length. Not very many passages in Mark are really long. This one is in our English 20 verses long, right? Another of which is its placement pretty early in the gospel, Mark 4, obviously. If you look at the placement of the same text in Matthew, it's Matthew chapter 13. It's quite a bit later. Luke has it in Luke 8. It's also, though, very important because it's the first parable that Jesus gives in Mark, and it's a parable about parables. It's a parable about why Jesus teaches parables at all, but also how to understand the parables. It comes with its interpretation, right? So Jesus tells the parable, and he goes aside with the disciples and tells them he's giving them the secret, the key, right, to understand. And then he explains the whole parable, what each of the components stands for, and what the overall point is. So, order, early in Mark. Length, actually quite long for Mark's standards. Content, it's a parable about parables, and in that parable about parables, Jesus gives this interpretive statement about why he even teaches in parables at all. Tells the disciples they have this privileged, special inside status, and they're being given the extra information they need in order to understand. But then there's this question, do they actually understand? All right? Now remember again, too, that all of that is associated with Jesus having just taught by the sea, giving the parable when he was on the sea in a boat. And what we see then, as we continue reading Mark, is we're going to see a triad that has all these same components in it. And then we'll see some other things as well. But we said that Mark is very selective, and he compresses things to come close back to back to back a lot of times. And when you see things that resemble each other being grouped together, you're meant to notice that. So let's read 3 more texts here. This is the first triad about sea or boat narratives. This is letter D2 on your outline. So if we start with chapter 4, verse 35, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Secondly, towards the end of chapter 6, 6:45. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Let me just, while we're reading this, make sure, I'll give you these clues if I didn't directly mention them yet. In all 3 of these, we're going to see Mark is putting something on the sea. They all happen on the sea or in a boat. He makes a very clear point that the disciples are away from the crowd, right? The crowd who are the outsiders. While they're on the sea privately with Jesus, they're given extra information or revelation about who he is by things that he says, by things he does. And in every instance, a clear question comes up: do they really understand? Or really, it's more the opposite. It's clear that they don't understand, right? So we just saw those components. Let me just make sure that you noticed them. Back to chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 36, leaving the crowd, right? Mark's making a point, going away from all the people, right? The outsiders. Getting in a boat, and then going onto the sea. Clearly, that's what the passage is about. They see something special, which is his calming the storm. And then Jesus says, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And then they're filled with fear, and they say to another question that obviously shows they don't understand who Jesus is. Who is this then, right? So those four components should be very evident in the passage. And then go to back to the text we were just on, Mark 6:45, and notice these same four components come up again. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. So we're going to separate off from the crowd again and be away from them. And after he had taken leave of them, that's a second time telling us that Jesus is leaving the crowd, right? Jesus went up on the mountain to pray, and when evening came, the boat was out on the sea. He was alone on the land. So initially he's apart from them. And he saw that in the boat they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. There's that theme again of being afraid rather than having faith. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And then here's their great response, right? They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. That means the loaves that Jesus had broken earlier when he fed the 5,000, earlier in the chapter. But their hearts were hardened. Now this is ramping it up here, isn't it? It even actually literally says something about the condition of their hearts, that they're hardened. Does anybody remember hearing about hardened hearts before? In that quote from Jesus about outsiders, back in chapter 4 in the parable of the sower. I'll just remind you, for those outside, everything is in parables, Luke 4:11, so that they, meaning outsiders, may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, right? An unperceptive heart or perception or ability to understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. There's a problem then in that these insiders who are being given the special information and the secret or mystery or key to understanding aren't actually understanding. This is a brief background here. The sea is originally, back in chapters 1 and 2, the place where Jesus calls a lot of his disciples. It's really strongly associated in Mark with a place that Jesus is with just his disciples doing discipleship things, right? So in any of these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, if you have a concordance, you can even do this digitally these days online, find a online Bible and search for things. But the theme of the sea comes up again and again and again, these locations. And you begin seeing this is where Jesus meets his disciples, calls his disciples, separates from the crowd with his disciples, right? The sea is kind of a discipleship place. But it's also, right now, repeatedly, a questions about the disciples' place, right? A place where Jesus keeps saying things to them, and then they have these odd exchanges where he's like, you don't get this, do you? Right? And Mark even says here that at this time in Mark 6, their hearts are hardened. Then let's go over to Mark 8. And we'll start at verse 13. There's a little exchange with the Pharisees, and then it says this. And he left them, meaning the Pharisees, got into the boat again and went to the other side. And you're going to see as they go that he's with his disciples. Actually, if you back up, you know that from verse 10. Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Then he has this interchange with the Pharisees, and then he leaves the Pharisees and got into the boat, i.e. with the disciples again, and went to their side. So he's with the disciples in a boat again, having left everybody else, including, in this case, the Pharisees, right? So if we're getting this picture again and again, we kind of have some inkling of what maybe to expect. And it says, now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat, and he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. He gives them this warning, and he uses the leaven imagery for that. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Right? We're back on the same theme. They don't understand what he's saying or why it's significant. They're preoccupied in this case with outward bread. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? Notice that eyes and ears language is even more strongly from the Mark 4 quotation, parable of the sower, right? Parables come to those outside so that seeing they may not see, right? Hearing they may not understand. Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces did you take up? And they said 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? So all 4 of these components come up again, right? They're on the sea, privately, away from everybody else, doing this insider discipleship thing. They get extra information, teaching, signs that Jesus does, right? But they don't understand. In fact, their condition sounds increasingly like the people who aren't on the sea or in private with Jesus, but are, in fact, outsiders. This is a persistent theme in Mark. The disciples, too, not just Jesus' family, are presented with a lot of shades of gray in Mark. People who really don't very well understand Jesus, who Jesus is. It will change some as we go here, but for quite a long time, it's negative. And even at the very end, we'll see it's not entirely positive. So what Mark has done then is he's given 3 passages here that are very, very similar. And as you get to the second, and as you get to the third, you're supposed to be being like, I think I saw this movie already, right? I remember this. And you're supposed to see the pattern. It's supposed to stand out to you as thematically significant. Now, another thing about this is you may have noticed something else being woven in here. There's actually a second triad, a second set of 3 that is interspersed with the one that we just read. So not only are there 3 boat narratives where the disciples get extra information privately with Jesus but don't understand, but there's also 3 feeding narratives where Jesus is in a desolate place or in an isolated place, right, a wilderness location, that kind of thing. And the disciples also don't understand that. So I'm trying to show you 2 different sets of 3 that join each other. Here, we won't read the whole thing, but in Mark chapter 6, you have the feeding of the 5,000, which it specifically, here it says, the apostles returned to Jesus. This is Mark 6:30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught when they were out and about preaching. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. Desolate place is one of those words for wilderness, right? Mark just really loves this theme. Come away with Jesus, away from the crowd, away from town, away from home, away from society. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat, and they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Notice he says the exact same thing a second time. He really wants you to notice it, right? Notice the location. Notice the location. Now many saw them going and recognized them and ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of him. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He began to teach them. As it grew late, he said, his disciples came to him and he said, "This is a desolate place." It's a desolate place where the crowd has come and where instruction is happening. The hour is now late. Send them away. His disciples are saying this. Send them away to go into the surrounding countrysides and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And then, of course, there's the whole episode of the feeding of the 5,000. Then in chapter 8, you see this similar thing happening again. Chapter 8, verse 1, in those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd." Notice how it's like, hey, yeah, another example of the same thing. "Because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, so they can't get to town, they can't get to their homes, they're out in the wilderness. Some of them have come from far away. His disciples said to them, "How can you feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" Hey, right? Ding, 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 ding. This sounds very familiar. He said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" He said, 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. He took the loaves, having given thanks, he broke it, etc. And then the same with the fish. And the people were satisfied, and they took up 7 baskets full of fish. And then he sent the crowd away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmunutha. And that's actually what leads then to the third feeding narrative, which is the one we already read, right? Where, again, his disciples, 8:14 and following, in an isolated place, in this case, again, the sea, with a shortage of bread, and they still don't get it, right? Jesus gives them a spiritual warning about the leaven, meaning the influence of the Pharisees and Herod, the spiritual influence that they need to be on guard against. And they're not receiving his teaching because they're preoccupied with the bread shortage. They only have 1 loaf of bread in the boat with them for as many people as they are, right? And Jesus' response is essentially, really? Really? Right? You've seen me calm the storm. You've seen me walk on water. We're in a boat again where miraculous things happen, right? You've seen me feed the 5,000. You've seen me feed the 4,000. And this is still where we're at, is that you can't even really pay attention to my instruction that I'm giving you privately as these insider people that go to all the discipleship places with me, away from home, away from town, right? And so notice his questions. I'd say it's a feeding narrative, not just because there's a bread shortage, but because he brings this directly up. He says, how many, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, Mark 8:19, how many baskets full of pieces did you take up? You did it yourselves, right? 12. And when I broke for the 4,000, how many baskets full of pieces? 7, right? In other words, you were there. And then that question, do you not yet understand? So what you have then is this interesting thing where you have 3 sea narratives, right? And you have 3 feeding narratives, but the third one in each 3 is the same, right? It's Mark 8:14 through 21. And so he's bringing all of these discipleship, special teaching, witnessing the power of Jesus in this extraordinary, miraculous way. Who is it that feeds Israelites bread in the wilderness? Well, you know your Old Testament, right? God feeds Israel manna in the wilderness. Who is it that has power even over the sea? Only God, right? And so the disciples are again and again and again witnessing the miraculous divine power of the Son of God, and they keep not understanding. They're being given the privilege of insiders, but their spiritual response is consistent with what Jesus described about outsiders, unbelievers whose hearts are hardened, right? So Mark 1 through 8, chapters 1 through 8. Sometimes I said before, the book of glory or the book of power, right? Jesus comes in announcing the kingdom of God and invading the territory and exorcising demons and stilling storms and feeding people and all this pronouncing forgiveness of sins, all these different things, right? Things that only God can do. But the only characters that seem to really understand who he is are what? Remember? Demons. The scribes and the Pharisees don't understand him and don't like him. His family's confused. His disciples are confused, right? This tremendous display of divine glory and power, and yet there's a lack of understanding. That's really the first half of Mark, right? You get a certain set of images, themes, associations, dominant kinds of events occurring. The divine Son of God who comes to his people in the wilderness, away from society, but even they, so far, don't understand who he is, right? Well, any questions or comments about that? Remember again that by not having certain things in his book, Mark gets all these things into close space to one another, right? So you can see these repetitions and patterns and be like, wow, right? And it worsens as you go. The strength of the language about the disciples not understanding gets worse each time, right? There's a heightening effect. All right. Well, thankfully that's not the end of Mark. And so next comes what has sometimes been called the book of suffering. And here again, there's clearly stylized design to the order and sequence and grouping that Mark gives. It's pretty neat, really, overall. Remember that this theme of whether eyes see and ears hear or hearts understand, right? This perception theme, is Jesus understood or not? Well, this is going to jump off the page in a new and particular way. And so let's read some texts and see some patterns here. So immediately after the text that we just read, where the disciples don't understand, and Jesus asks, having eyes do you not see and having ears do you not hear, in Mark 8:18, we come to this, the first of two healings of blind men. And so in Mark 8:22, we're going to start the next sort of phase of the gospel, gets kicked off here. And it says, and they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, but they look like trees walking. And Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and opened his eyes, and his sight was restored. And he saw clearly, and he sent him to his home and said, do not even enter the village. Then comes one of the most encouraging texts so far, at least initially. Peter professes who Jesus is correctly. And so Jesus is with his disciples, and he goes to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, they're walking, not yet there, he says to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Of course, that's familiar from before. He keeps telling people not to say who he is. So that was really good. You have the healing of a blind man. You have Peter's confession properly that Jesus is the Christ. And then comes the next major ingredient. Verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, right? Not in parables, not in some thing that's hard to understand. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he, Jesus, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And then he gives this teaching about the necessity of the cross, even for disciples. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me," etc. So we have a sequence. Blind man healed. Peter confesses Christ. Jesus teaches about the necessity of the cross. Peter doesn't understand that or accept that and responds by saying, never, sort of, right? This can't be true. Okay? Then if we scan forward into chapter 9, we're going to see something similar again. They went on from there. This is chapter 9, verse 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples. Again, this is this private discipleship context, right? These people get the information, don't tell the people out there. And what is he teaching them? Well, it's the same thing that we heard earlier. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. But notice this theme that we've seen before. They didn't understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. They're still not understanding, right? And then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me," etc. Notice that it's the same set of things that happened before. It's Jesus teaching about the necessity of his death, the disciples not understanding that, and saying, "Far be it from you, that's not right for the Christ, that's, not a good teaching, never." And then Jesus, this time they even begin arguing, instead of, who can be a servant like Jesus, they're arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus has to teach them directly again about what makes for good discipleship, not grabbing something for yourself that makes you great, but being humble and a servant, right? So Jesus teaches about the necessity of his death. His disciples don't understand it, but instead grasp after glory. And Jesus responds by teaching what true humility and discipleship look like in chapter 8, now again in chapter 9. And if we turn the page over to chapter 10 and begin in chapter 10, verse 32, notice if this doesn't sound familiar. "And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12, he began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, 'See, we're going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise,'" right? All of that sounds very, very familiar. It's a variant on exactly what he said the 2 other times, right? All the way down to the 3 days and the rising. "And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.' And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And he said to them, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized, which of course means his death, right? In other words, you want the glory. Are you able to you want to be right there with me, right hand and left hand in glory? Are you going to be with me, right hand and left hand in my death? Which they're not. But they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. And then we get a kind of a part 2 on this about seeking glory, right? When the disciples heard, they began to be indignant at James and John, and Jesus called them to him and said to him, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority of them. But it shall not be so among you, but whoever should be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Many people have taken that verse, chapter 10, verse 45, as really the theme verse of all of Mark, and it could appropriately be said to be that. And then, what happens immediately after Jesus heals another blind man, blind Bartimaeus. So we saw here before how there were 3 sea narratives and the 3 feeding narratives. The last of each of those was actually the same. They came together, the 2 sets of 3. Here we see Jesus heals a blind man. Then he predicts his death. Then the disciples oppose, seek glory. That kind of gets worse and worse each time. Then he teaches them about true humility or true discipleship, same thing, right? In other words, you need to be like the Christ whom you are following, who has to go to suffering and death for the sake of others. And then he heals another blind man. That's chapters 8 through 10, or at least most of chapter 8. So if we have the book of glory, chapters 1 through 8, now we have the book of suffering, and the theme of discipleship continues through here. The disciples don't understand the true nature of Christ's power, and they also don't understand the true nature of his suffering. Probably when Peter said, you are the Christ, earlier in chapter 8, right? Right before the first time Jesus predicted his death, Peter finally thought he was starting to understand Christ's power, right? I got it. You're the Christ, which of course is correct, but he's also not the kind of Christ that Peter thought of at that point, right? Not a suffering Christ, not a ransom for others, ransom for many Christ, right? Not a the last shall be first Christ. And of course, Peter's not alone in that. James and John are singled out in parts of it, but all the disciples are ticked off, right? Because James and John are wanting glory, but they want glory. So we see that Mark keeps giving us these repetitions. He did it in the first half several times. There's other ones that we didn't look at, these triads. He's doing it in the second half. And then obviously from there, you continue to get more book of suffering topics, right? Jesus is going into Jerusalem and the triumphal entry, but of course the understanding of the crowds about him in the triumphal entry is mistaken. You can notice this here. This is a little bit different in Mark, the wording in the triumphal entry. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Mark 11, verse 10, Hosanna in the highest, right? The Jews wanted big Davidic kingdom. Jesus has already said 3 times to his disciples, no, he has to die. Jesus curses the fig tree, cleanses the temple after that. A lot of things that are going to happen. We can't, of course, look at all of it, but he tells the parable of the tenants, which is one of the things that, again, makes clear that particular parable. If you remember, there's a man who owns a vineyard, and then his servants wreck it, take it for themselves, and so forth. He sends other servants to displace them, and eventually he sends his own son, and then they kill him, right? Very clear parable in which Jesus teaches that he himself is God's son, greater than any other servant of God previously. And then in chapter 12, verse 10, he specifically quotes Old Testament about the stone that the builders reject has become the cornerstone. And so it's obviously all about Jesus' own rejection by his people. Chapter 13 talks about the future destruction of the temple. In chapter 14, you're getting directly into the plot to kill Jesus and the immediate things preceding his death. And so really, all of these chapters have much to do with going to Jerusalem and experiencing rejection there, which is going to lead to his crucifixion. Let's look at one more detail before we look at the very end of Mark. We're taking large strides here, but this is kind of interesting. Mark 15, verses 38 and 39. Mark 15. So this is the very last piece of the crucifixion narrative when Jesus actually dies. It says, verse 37, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain, verse 38 of chapter 15, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. There's 2 things that come back to back there in a way that you've only seen one other time in Mark, which we actually read it, but we read it last week. Let me read it. I'll read 2 different verses and see if you pick up on it. And when he, Jesus, came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, you are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. Do you hear the echo there? Go back here to Mark 15. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who saw him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. There's a tearing, and there's a declaration of sonship, right? And you all know that the curtain in the temple represented the division between God's own presence and human dwelling place, right? In other words, the curtain in the temple represents the division between heaven and earth. And so the beginning, chapter 1, and the end, chapter 15, after Jesus has died, you have another tearing, right? Here, the temple itself, where God's presence is torn open as if access to heaven is directly granted, right? The division between man and God is torn, and the declaration that Jesus is God's Son. It's interesting that it's from a centurion's lips because in Roman thought, the Caesar was the descendant of the gods, really a semi-divine figure. There's a whole background to that. But it's quite likely here that what the centurion means when he says, truly this is the Son of God, is this man is divine, right? This is the real divine man, not Caesar Augustus or whoever else was reigning after him. So you see the book of glory, the book of suffering. You see this theme of discipleship throughout. Disciples really struggle to understand very much. It's really quite, in general, a negative portrait of the disciples. There are some glimmers of hope for the disciples along the way. In chapter 10, verse 39, Jesus says they will suffer for his sake in the future. In chapter 13, he says someday they will testify before kings and governors. So we know from what Jesus has said that eventually they're going to get it better and they're going to serve him better. But we don't actually see that happening yet. End of Mark is very curious. We don't have tons of time left, but just read it here to get a little bit of the effect, because endings are so important. So we'll read Mark 16 here, 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen, and he is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they went away, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, you can see that there's some older, actually I should say some newer, some more recent manuscripts that have a longer ending than that, but it, from all the evidence, it doesn't appear to be original. The original ending is right there. It's a very curious ending, isn't it? It doesn't tie things into a neat bow. It doesn't come through. It's like ending on a unresolved chord almost, right? No resolution musically. We have a music guy over here, right? We're still in the minor key. Being afraid, not fully understanding, continues here for the disciples. Why would Mark end this way? Well, it's clear that things are going to get better. Jesus is going to go ahead of them into Galilee. And it's been stated that he's risen. But you don't see like Peter's reconciliation with Jesus like you see in John. You don't see the Emmaus Road where Jesus comes and feeds them, teaches them, or later on in Luke 24, feeds them. You don't see the Great Commission, right? I'm with you always into the end of the world, into the end of the age, right? Mountaintop. I think that some of the reason here is that Mark wants to keep in our minds and not let us just leave behind what we read, right? Oh, and then everything turned out better and it's happy. This persistent conflict, the isolation of Jesus, the crucial question, do you understand? Do you have faith? Do you understand the divinity of Jesus? Do you understand the suffering of Jesus, right? It stays with you. You walk away reflective. It's like the movie that has kind of that melancholy question mark ending. Well, did they ever resolve it? And it makes you think. Mark doesn't want us to get away from the isolated and misunderstood Jesus and the cost of discipleship. To put it a little bit differently, Mark doesn't want us to leave behind the cross and suffering and abandonment and go on to triumph, triumphalism, right? Jesus died, and now we get to reign. He says, let's hang out here in the wilderness a bit longer, right? Not in society, not with popularity, not with glory of that sort, popularity, right? Jesus has not come to build a kingdom that replaces Rome or America or whatever, or rivals those things. Jesus has come to seek and to save the lost, to give his life as a ransom for many, and the point is made again and again and again. If you want to come after him, take up your cross and follow in sacrifice and service, which is not going to build you popularity either, right? Yes, there are greater things coming, but at the end of this particular story and movie, we're left to reflect on the abandoned Jesus, the not fully understood Jesus, right? Which, assumedly, is something of what this particular church that Mark writes to is going through too. There's kind of two options, it seems to me. Traditionally, people have often associated Mark with being written in Italy or in Rome. That's not for sure, but there are lots of church traditions that say that. Is the church experiencing a false triumphalism? And they really need a gospel about the suffering and misunderstood and abandoned Jesus? Alternatively, is the church experiencing suffering and abandonment? And they need to be encouraged by the Christ who joins them in that and experienced it even before they did, and see that what they're experiencing is after his pattern, after his likeness, right? Maybe there's some of both. There are various points in the history of the Christianity in Rome or Italy where great opposition came up from Jews or from Roman officials, right? But if you live in the capital of the world, you're either experiencing some success and you feel very important, or if you're being opposed, you feel utterly betrayed and disenfranchised. And probably the audience to which this is written was experiencing one of those two things. But whatever the case, the audience to which this is written needed to see this particular movie about Christ. It's not the Son of David, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, go and make disciples movie, right? That one's true too. But this one chooses different parts of the same life and puts them together to say, make sure you see this aspect as well, right? The wilderness Son of God, who did not come to claim the halls of power in a mode of human kingship, but came in particular to oppose Satan and redeem people from his rule by going to the cross, right? Many people have said the Gospel of Mark is like a passion narrative, a description of Christ's death with a long introduction. And the point of saying that is Christ's death is so big and dominates the whole narrative, right? The disciples' misunderstanding of him and his family's misunderstanding of him also looms quite large. In some ways, the Gospel of Mark is like a story form of what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 to 10. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 and following says this, to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, right? The greatness of the power at work. This is the Apostle Paul. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamity. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The Gospel of Mark shows Christ suffering and becoming weak despite how much power he had as the divine, glorious Son of God. And that's meant to lead to our having power in the midst of our weakness in and through him, right? This is, the Gospel of Mark is the precondition. It's the mirror opposite of what Paul says, right? Grandeur and power becoming weak for others, so that in our weakness we might be made strong and serve him and love others in a humble way rather than in a conceited way, as we would otherwise tend to do.